Genevieve Sterling looked at me the way some people look at a water stain on a tablecloth they paid too much for, and then she said the cruelest, beautiful thing anybody has ever said to me. "Make my husband's clock keep time again, Mr. Whitaker, and I'll let you marry my daughter." She said it the way a woman like that hands a valet a folded bill, without looking certain it would be taken. 76 years old, standing under the portico of a house on Bellevue Avenue that had been in her family since the railroads were young, in a cashmere the color of fresh cream, looking down at a 44-year-old man in a canvas work coat with clock oil already grounded to the lines of his thumbs. She didn't smile when she said it. That's how I knew it wasn't a joke. It was a test, and it was meant to sting. And the thing she had no way of knowing was that she'd aimed it by pure dumb accident straight at the oldest bruise I carry. Because I knew exactly who her daughter was. I'd known Claire Sterling a whole lifetime before that morning, before Genevieve had made good and sure that whatever Claire and I had got buried so deep, neither of us ever went looking for it again. I took the job anyway. 3 weeks later, deep in the movement of a clock that hadn't ticked in 6 years, I found the one small thing that 4 better-known restorers had all walked right past. And what was hidden with it cracked that whole proud, frozen family open like ice going off a pond in March. It cracked me open, too, in a way I wasn't expecting and wasn't ready for. But before I tell you what was behind that dial, do something for me. If you've ever had somebody size you up in 3 seconds, decide what you're worth, and tuck you in a little box in their head, and then you went and proved them dead wrong, not with your mouth but with your hands, then hit that subscribe button. This whole channel is for guys like us, the ones who show up, do the work, raise the kids, and let the work do the talking while everybody else is busy talking. Go on. I'll wait right here. My name is Dale Whitaker, and I fix clocks that everyone else has given up for dead. Not the battery ones off a shelf at the drugstore. I mean the old ones. Tall case clocks that a man built by hand 200 years ago and signed on the back of the dial like a painter. 8-day movements, brass and steel, weights and gut line and a pendulum that's been swinging out the same arc since before there was a country to swing it in. It's a dying trade. There's maybe a few hundred of us left who can do it right, and we lose a couple every year. Because the men who teach it are getting old, and the young people, smart as they are, want to fix things that actually pay. My grandfather taught me in the back of a watch repair shop in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, with a loop screwed into his eye and a patience I have spent my whole life trying to grow into. When I lean over a movement now and my hands go quiet and sure, sometimes I'd swear they were his hands and not mine. I work alone, mostly, out of a narrow shop 2 blocks off the river. Brick walls, a radiator that knocks, good north light, and a smell of brass and old wood and clock oil that I stopped being able to smell years ago because it's just the smell of my whole life. I've got a girl, Nora. She was 12 that fall. Smart as a whip, and twice as quick to cut you with it, which she got from her mother. Her mother, Annie, my wife, died 2.5 years before any of this. It was the slow kind, the kind that gives you a whole long winter of warning and somehow still leaves you standing at the end of it. Sure, you said all the wrong things. I won't sit you down in that hospital room, but there's one thing Annie said to me near the end that I carried into the Sterling house without even knowing I had it in my pocket. She was thin by then, propped up, clear in the eye the way she got near the finish, and she looked at me, and she said, "Dale, you can make a 200-year-old clock keep perfect time, but you let the clock in your own house run down. You'll sit with a stranger's machine for a month, and you won't sit with your own daughter for 10 minutes. I told her that wasn't fair. She just smiled at me, that tired smile, the one she gave me when she knew I'd understand her someday. Just not in time for it to do either of us any good. The call came on a gray Wednesday in October. A lawyer's voice, the smooth kind, the kind that bills you in 15-minute pieces and makes you feel grateful for the bill. Mrs. Genevieve Sterling had a timepiece of considerable value that had ceased functioning. A tall case clock. English, mid-18th century. It had not run in 6 years. Several specialists had been unable to restore it. My name had come up through a collector down in Mystic I'd done some work for. Would I be willing to come and have a look? I knew the Sterling name the way everybody in this part of New England knows it. Old money, old house, the kind of family that has a window in a church and a wing on a hospital and 3 generations of strong opinions about exactly who belongs where. And I knew it for one other reason, a private one I hadn't said out loud in better than 20 years and had no plans to start saying now. I told the lawyer I'd come Friday. The house sat behind a stone wall and a gate that opened on its own when I pulled up, which I always find unsettling, like the place was expecting me. Gravel drive, copper beaches gone red, the ocean somewhere off behind it making that sound the ocean makes, that you feel more than here. It was one of those Gilded Age cottages the Newport people built when cottage meant 40 rooms. Beautiful and a little sad, the way those houses get kept alive by money and stubbornness and not much else. Genevieve met me on the steps. She did not ask me in. She looked at my truck, then at my coat, then at my face, and I watched her finish the math on all three in about the time it takes a second hand to cross the 6. That's when she said it. The line about her daughter, and I understood the cruelty of it exactly, because I understood what she was really saying underneath the words. She was saying, "You are so far below this family that the most absurd, impossible prize I can dangle is the idea of you near one of us." It was meant to plant me in my place before I'd taken a single step out of it. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 22 years ago I'd already been near one of them. I'd been about as near as a person gets, and she'd been the one to end it. "I'll take a look at the clock, ma'am," I said, and I kept my voice as flat and level as a setting tool. "We can talk about my rate once I know what I'm dealing with." She blinked. Just barely. I don't think she was used to being answered like the joke hadn't landed. Then she turned and led me through the house, past rooms that looked like nobody had breathed in them in years, heels clicking on marble, not once looking back to see if I was keeping up. The clock stood in a hall off the library, 8.5 feet of mahogany with a swan neck top and a brass dial gone soft and gold with age. A real one, the kind I've spent my whole life hoping somebody would put in front of me. And when I opened the trunk door and looked at the movement hanging there still and dead, I felt the thing I always feel with these, something close to tenderness. People laugh when I tell them that. Let them. A clock like that isn't a machine to me. It's a man's whole working life, frozen, waiting for somebody to give it back its breath. My husband loved this clock more than he loved most people, Genevieve said from the doorway. I hadn't figured she'd follow me in. Theodore. He passed 6 years ago this month. The clock stopped within a fortnight of the funeral, as if it had decided to go along with him. She said it the way you'd report a betrayal. I've had 4 men try since. Real horologists. One from Boston, one from New York, a fellow flown in from London. They all told me the same ridiculous thing, that there was nothing they could find wrong with it, and yet it would not run, as though it were being difficult on purpose. She said on purpose, like it was a personal insult the clock had paid her, and she was passing it along to me to see if I'd do any better. I didn't answer right off. You don't talk to a worried owner the way you talk to a clock. I ran my fingers down the case, felt the honesty of the wood, and I opened the hood and just looked for a long minute at the movement without touching it. My grandfather taught me that. You listen before you ever pick up a tool, because the thing will tell you what's wrong if you give it enough quiet to say it in. 3 weeks. I said finally. I'll need to take the movement back to my shop. And I work alone. Nobody standing over my shoulder. She named a number then. A big one. Bigger than the work was worth, and the way she said it told me everything. She was buying a show. She fully expected me to fail like the other 4, and she was pricing the entertainment of watching one more working man get beat by her dead husband's clock. I took the number anyway. I had my own reasons, and they had nothing to do with the money. Because I have to tell you about Claire now. Without Claire, none of the rest of it lands. 22 years back, I was a kid clerking the counter at an antiques place on Thames Street while I learned the repair side in the back. Claire Sterling used to come in. She was studying art history up in Providence, and she'd drift through on weekends, and she had a way of stopping in front of an old mantel clock and just standing there until I came over. She'd ask me questions. Not the polite kind rich girls ask to seem nice, real ones. How does this part move that part? Why'd the maker do it this way and not that? How do you know when something's worth saving? And I'd answer her, because nobody had ever asked me those things like they truly wanted to hear it, and she'd listen with her whole face. She was 22. I was 22. She was a Sterling, and I was a kid with a high school diploma and dirt under his nails, and by every rule of how Newport was built, nothing was supposed to happen. But she lingered. That's how it always started. She'd linger, and I'd find reasons the work was taking longer than it was, just so she'd stay. We had one summer. The best summer of my life, and I've had some good ones since, with a woman I loved all the way down to the floor of me, so I don't say that lightly. We thought we were careful. We met where we figured nobody would see. For 3 months I believed, with the particular stupidity of being 22 and gone on somebody, that the way the world was built just didn't apply to us. Then Genevieve found out. I never knew exactly what she said to Claire because Claire wouldn't repeat it, not even at the end, when she stood in the alley behind the shop crying and telling me it had to stop. But Claire quit coming around, and about a week after that, a man came to see me. Not a lawyer exactly, a friend of the family, the polished, regretful kind. And it got explained to me in that soft, well-bred way that's somehow worse than yelling, that I was a young man with a future to think of, and that Claire had a future too, and that the two of them were never going to cross. There was nothing in it you could have repeated to a soul and called a threat. That was the genius of how those people did things. A month later, I heard Claire had transferred to a school out in California. I wrote her one letter. I never knew if it got to her. Years on, I met Annie at a wedding, and I loved Annie with everything I had, and that is not a contradiction. A man's heart's got room for more than one true thing in it. Anybody who tells you different has only ever loved the once. So when Genevieve Sterling stood on her steps and offered me her daughter like a punchline, she was holding out. With no idea on God's earth she was doing it, the exact thing she'd taken out of my hands a lifetime before. That's why I took the job. Not for the money I'd been insulted to be offered. Not even, really, for Claire, who I figured was long married and long gone and a stranger to me by now. I took it because the stubborn part of me, the part my grandfather pressed into me along with everything else, wanted to stand inside that family's house and do the one thing all their money and all their certainty had never once been able to buy. I wanted to make the dead man's clock keep perfect time. I wanted Genevieve Sterling to stand in that hall and hear it strike and know it was done by the same man she'd thrown out the back door. The first week, I did exactly what those 4 men must have done. You start with the obvious. I cleaned the movement, checked the pivots, the bushings, the gut line, the weights, the suspension spring. And the more I looked, the stranger it got, because that movement was magnificent. Theodore Sterling had cared for it like a man cares for a horse he loves. No rust, no rodent damage, the steel still bright where it should be bright. Every wheel turned true. The escapement was clean. By every test I knew how to run, and I know a lot of them. That clock should have ticked off the wall the second I hung it level and gave the pendulum a nudge. And it wouldn't so much as breathe. That's where the other 4 had stopped. I get it, they'd hit the edge of what they could explain, called it a mystery, written up the bill for their time, and gone home to easier work. There's no shame in it exactly, but my grandfather had a saying, and I heard it in his voice standing in my shop at the end of that first week. He used to say, "A clock that ought to run and won't isn't a mystery, son. It's a message. Somebody's trying to tell you something. Your whole job is to get quiet enough to hear what." So I got quiet. I quit trying to make it go. That was the whole trick, and it took me a week to remember it. I stopped attacking it, and I started reading it, slow, the way you'd read a letter from somebody you'd lost, following each part from one end to the other, feeling for the place where the story stopped making sense. And on the 3rd day of doing that, low in the going train, my fingers found the first wrong note. The escapement had been adjusted. Not broken, adjusted. Set, with real skill, by a knowing hand, so the pallet sat just a hair off where they belonged. Close enough that everything looked right, far enough that the thing could never actually catch and run. It was the kind of setting you'd never find by testing parts, because not one part was bad. They'd all just been quietly told to work against each other. A clock built to fight itself. I sat back on my stool and felt the hair stand up on my arms, because here's a thing I know down in my bones after 30 years. There is all the difference in the world between a part that has failed and a part that has been set. A failure is random. It's the universe wearing things down the way it wears everything down. But this was a decision. Somebody had reached into this clock and made dead sure it would never run again, and done it in a way that would read, to any honest restorer who didn't know the thing intimately, as a phantom fault, a ghost, a clock being difficult on purpose. And there was exactly one man on earth who'd known this clock well enough to do that, the man who died the same month it stopped. Theodore Sterling had stopped his own beloved clock. on purpose, with his own hands, as one of the last things he ever did. I sat with that a long while there in the quiet of my shop, and then I went looking for the why of it. Because a man doesn't kill the thing he loves best for no reason. He does it as a message, and I'd already been told the clock was trying to say something. So I followed it back, past where any ordinary repair would ever take you, to the false back panel behind the dial, the kind of hidden space a few of the old makers built in, a little compartment a man could keep a will in, or a ring, or a secret. And it had been opened recently in the life of a clock 6 years stopped. The screws were clean where everything around them had gone dull. Somebody had been in there last, and closed it, and meant for it to stay closed until the right person came. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth and laid in a slot that had been cleared on purpose to hold it, was a letter, a thick one, folded over, sealed, and across the front, in fading fountain pen ink, in a careful old-fashioned hand, was a name. And the name wasn't Genevieve. The name was Claire. I knelt there with that letter in my 2 greasy hands, and I felt 22 years rearrange themselves around me in the dark, like furniture being moved in a room with the lights off. Because all at once I understood what Theodore Sterling had done. He'd hidden a letter to his daughter inside the one object on this earth he knew his family would never throw out and would never, ever be able to open on their own. He'd locked his last words inside a machine that only a true craftsman could reach, because to find it, you'd have to love the clock enough and know it well enough to follow its silence all the way down to this one hidden place. And to make absolutely certain that someday somebody would have to dig this deep, he'd reached in and stopped the clock from running. The dead clock wasn't broken. It was a locked box. The stopped movement was the lock. And the key was a kind of person, not a kind of tool. I did not open it. I want you to know that. I held the dead man's last words to his daughter, alone, with nobody watching, and I did not open the letter, because some things aren't yours, no matter whose hands find them. But I knew I couldn't carry it up to Genevieve either, because it wasn't hers. I went back out to the Sterling house that evening, and I found Genevieve in a sunroom gone gold with the last of the light, and I asked her, as gentle as I knew how, whether her daughter, whether Claire, was still living. The question went through her like a current. I watched it. Her face did something complicated and shut it away fast. "She's in Boston," she said at last, very upright, very stiff. "We're not close." A pause that cost her something real. "We haven't spoken in a long while." "Since Mr. Sterling passed?" I asked. "Before that," she said, and she turned to look out at the copper beaches, and in the set of her shoulders I read the whole truth of it, that whatever had broken in this family was old, that it had been there long before Theodore died, that the old man had died down inside the crack of it, and that it had never once healed in all the years since. I told her, careful, that I'd found something inside the clock that belonged to Claire, and that I felt it ought to go to Claire directly, from my hand to hers. Genevieve's first move was the move of a woman who'd spent 76 years controlling everything inside her reach. She put out her hand, palm up. An old habit of command. I didn't give it to her. I stood in her sunroom and I said, as respectfully as I had it in me to say, that her husband had hidden this where only the work itself could find it, with Claire's name on it in his own ink, and that I believed with everything in me he had meant it to travel to Claire by exactly that road and no other, and that I was not going to be the man who overruled the last careful thing a dying man ever did. I was sure she'd fire me where I stood. For a long, cold beat she looked at me with those pale, unbending eyes, and I waited for it, and then something in them cracked. Just a hairline, the kind of crack I've spent my life learning to find in old brass. And she lowered her hand, and she said, quiet, almost to herself, "Theodore always did love that girl more than he loved me, even at the end, especially at the end." And she gave a small, dry, bitter laugh with a whole marriage folded up inside it. 50 years of a particular kind of lonely I had no right to understand and somehow did anyway. It took me 2 days to run down a phone number for Claire Sterling. When I finally had it, and I dialed it, and a woman's voice said hello, I said just my name. "This is Dale Whitaker." And the silence on that line went so long and so total that I honestly thought she'd hung up. And then, into it, she said one word. "Dale." Just that. The way a person says a name they haven't let themselves say out loud in a very long time. She drove down that weekend. I won't lie to you and tell you the years fell off when she walked into my shop, because they don't, and anybody who says they do is selling something. We were different people. She was 44 like me, divorced, a grown daughter of her own up near Portland. There were lines at the corners of her eyes the world had put there while I wasn't looking, and gray she hadn't bothered to fight, and a carefulness in how she held herself that the girl of 22 never had. But when she came through that door and saw the movement laid out on my bench, and then saw me standing next to it in my work coat with oil on my hands, in just about the same spot she'd left me standing 22 years before, she stopped dead, and she put her hand over her mouth, and she laughed and she cried at the exact same time. I gave her the letter. I told her where I'd found it and what I'd worked out about why. That her father had stopped his own clock, the thing he loved best in the world, to make good and sure that one day somebody would have to dig all the way down to that hidden place and carry up what was waiting. She sat down slow on the stool by my bench, the letter in her lap, and I stepped out the back into the cold and pulled the door most of the way shut behind me, and I let her read her father's words alone. That much I could give her. The privacy of it. It was the least and the most I had. She told me later what was in it. Not all of it. Some of it was hers and stayed hers as it should, but the heart of it she gave me. Theodore had known he was dying when he wrote it. He'd known his wife and his daughter had been torn apart years back over Claire's choices, over who she loved and how she meant to live her life, over a kid in a work apron one long ago summer, and everyone and everything that came after him, and Genevieve's iron certainty about exactly who her daughter was allowed to be. And Theodore had spent his whole life keeping the peace in that house by saying nothing, by being pleasant and absent and quiet. And he died knowing his silence had cost him the two people he loved most in the world. The letter was his apology. A dying man putting down in ink the things he'd been too much of a coward to say out loud, that he'd been wrong to stay quiet, that he'd loved her exactly as she was, that he was sorry, so deeply sorry, and that he prayed whoever finally got his old clock running again, because it would have to be somebody good, would have the decency to carry it the rest of the way. And there was one line, Claire told me, that broke her clean in half. Her father had written, "I could not mend what I broke while I was alive, so I have hidden this inside the one thing I trust to outlast me, and I will let a better man's hands carry it the rest of the way." A better man's hands. He'd been dead 6 years before I ever touched his clock. And somehow, across all that time, he'd written a part into his last act for a stranger he'd never meet to come along and play. Now, I told you at the start this isn't a fairy tale, and I meant it. Claire and Genevieve did not fall weeping into each other's arms and fix 22 years in one golden afternoon. That's not how real families work, and it's especially not how proud ones work. What actually happened was smaller and harder and a whole lot more real than that. Claire took the letter to her mother. The two of them sat down together in that big, sad, beautiful house with a dead man's words on the table between them like a third person who'd finally decided to tell the truth. I wasn't there. It wasn't my place, and I wouldn't have gone if they'd asked. But Claire told me afterward that her mother wept. Genevieve Sterling, who I'd have bet my whole shop had no tears left in her anywhere, and that her mother said the two words Claire had waited her entire life to hear and had long since stopped expecting. "I'm sorry." Just like the letter. The husband in ink and the wife out loud, both of them finally arriving at the same two words from opposite ends of one long silence. Didn't fix everything. I won't tell you it did. But it started something that had been stopped a very long time, the way a clock starts. They talk now, Claire and Genevieve. Sunday phone calls. It isn't warm, exactly. I don't think there's much warm in those two for each other. Not after everything. But it's real, and it's honest, and at their ages real and honest is most of what's left worth having. And the clock. I finished the clock. Of course I finished it. I undid what Theodore had so carefully done. I set the escapement back true, and then I went through the whole movement the way it deserved, the way he'd have wanted, because by then I felt like I half knew the man. And on a clear, cold morning in the second week of November, in my own shop with the radiator knocking and the light coming gray off the river, I hung it level, and I gave the pendulum its first push in 6 years. It caught. And it ran. That deep, slow, patient tick that fills up a whole room. The sound of something built by hand to outlast every person who'd ever touch it. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. Genevieve came to the shop to hear it run before I brought it home to her. She stood in my doorway, this woman who'd looked at me like something off the bottom of a shoe 3 weeks before, and she listened to her dead husband's clock keeping time for the first time since the month she buried him. And she put one thin hand flat on the doorframe to steady herself, and for a long while she didn't say a word. Then she crossed the shop and held out her hand, and when I took it, she gripped harder than I'd have guessed was in her. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "2 of them, I believe, though you only know about 1. And I understood in that second that somewhere across those 3 weeks she'd remembered. The summer, the kid at the antiques counter, my name. She'd known for some days exactly who I was, and the knowing had done something to her that all her certainty had never let anything do. "You loved my daughter," she said. "It wasn't a question." "A long time ago," I said, "and you ended it." She nodded, slow, looking not at me now but at the clock. I spent my whole life perfectly sure I knew what was beneath this family and what was above it. And my husband hid the truest words he ever wrote in the one place he knew only a man I'd called beneath us would ever reach. He trusted your hands more than he trusted his own blood, more than he trusted me. Her voice caught, and she got hold of it. He was right to. I did not marry her daughter. I want to be real clear about that because the way this whole thing started was a proud old woman's cruel little joke, and I won't turn it into a tidy romance to make you feel good walking away from it. Claire and I are something. I don't have a clean word for what. We had dinner the week the clock ran. We've had a few since. At 44, with a kid I'm raising and a wife I buried and 22 lost years standing in the road between us, you don't rush, and you don't owe anybody. Least of all an audience, a happy ending. We're letting it be exactly and honestly whatever it turns out to be, and I've found at my age that that's plenty, that it might even be the whole point. But here's the part that actually changed me, and it isn't the part you'd guess. I drove home from delivering that clock with the tick of it still going somewhere behind my ribs, and I thought about Theodore Sterling, a man who kept the peace his whole life by staying quiet, and died regretting every word he never said, and got reduced in the end to hiding his love and his sorry inside a machine and praying a stranger would deliver them after he was gone, because he'd run clean out of time to deliver them himself. And then I thought about Annie, in that hospital bed, telling me I'd sit with a stranger's machine for a month and I wouldn't sit with my own daughter for 10 minutes. I came in the back door that night and Nora was at the kitchen table doing homework, and she barely looked up. Because that's what we'd become to each other in the 2.5 years since her mom died, 2 people sharing a house and a refrigerator, and not much else. Because I'd gone quiet, the exact same way Theodore Sterling went quiet. I'd buried myself in other people's stopped clocks so I wouldn't have to sit in the silence of my own stopped house. So I sat down across from her, and she gave me a look like, "What?" And I said the things I should have said 2 years before. I told her I was sorry. I told her I knew I'd disappeared into the shop after her mom passed, and that I'd left her alone inside her own sad because I had no idea how to be inside mine. I told her I saw her, that I was proud of her in a way I'd been feeling for a long time and had never once pushed out through my mouth. And my 12-year-old, my tough, smart-mouthed kid, put her pencil down, and her chin went, and she said, "Real quiet. I thought you didn't want to be around me anymore." And that about took my legs out from under me, because she'd been carrying that for 2 years in the next room, and all it would have cost me to fix it was the thing it cost to wind a clock. We talked half the night. We've been talking since. She comes out to the shop with me Saturdays now. I'm teaching her the loop, the patience, my grandfather's hands. She's better at it than I was at her age, and I tell her so, out loud, every single time, because I'm done saving the true things for a letter nobody finds until I'm gone. Because that's the thing I learned inside a dead man's clock. Theodore had to hide his apology in a machine because he ran out of time to say it with his own mouth. He had to trust a stranger's hands to carry what his own heart never could. But I wasn't out of time. My girl was right there in the next room. Not a letter sealed behind a dial. Not a message that needed a craftsman and 6 years and a small miracle to get where it was going. One conversation. One Tuesday night at a kitchen table, and I'd been treating it like the hardest repair in the world. The hardest things to fix are almost never the ones on the bench. They're the ones we walk past every single day because we've quietly decided they're too far gone, or it's too late, or it's not our place to reach in. And we are almost always wrong about that. It is not too far gone. It is not too late. Not while the other person is still here, still under the same roof, still on the other end of a silence, waiting to hear from us. So let me ask you one thing before you go. Is there a call you've been putting off? Somebody who's still here to hear it? An apology, or an I'm proud of you, or an I'm sorry, or just an I miss you? And if there is, what is actually stopping you from making it tonight, while there's still time, while they've still got a phone in their pocket and a chair at the table? Tell me down in the comments. I read everyone. I'd truly like to know. And if this story reached something in you, if you've come to believe, like I have, that the most important repairs we ever make are the ones with the people we love and not the machines, then do me that one favor and hit subscribe. Leave a like so the next person finds their way here. And I'll see you in the next one. The thing I keep coming back to is that Theodore Sterling didn't run out of love. He ran out of time. He had every good feeling a father could have for Claire, and he locked it inside a clock instead of saying it across a dinner table, because saying it out loud would have meant standing up to Genevieve, and he never once found it in himself to do that. That was his real failure, not weakness of feeling, weakness of nerve. And his daughter paid for it with 22 years of believing her own father had taken her mother's side by staying silent. I think about that every time Nora climbs onto the stool next to my bench now, because I almost did the same thing to her. I almost let 2 years of quiet harden into 20. The only reason I didn't is that a dead man I never met handed me a mirror, and I was honest enough with myself to look in it instead of away. That honesty cost me something. It is not comfortable to sit across from your own kid and admit you went missing on her when she needed you most, but the comfortable thing and the right thing were standing in 2 different rooms, and I finally walked into the right one. Here's what that whole season taught me, and I'd hand it to you the way my grandfather handed me his tools. First, do the decent thing even when nobody is watching and nobody would ever know. I held a sealed letter alone in an empty shop, and the only reason it reached Claire instead of Genevieve is that I decided whose it was and didn't bend. Second, slow down enough to actually understand the problem before you attack it. 4 skilled men failed on that clock because they tried to force it. It only opened up to me when I got quiet and let it tell me what was wrong. People are the same. Most of the time we're trying to fix somebody when we haven't once stopped to hear what they're actually saying underneath. And third, the hard conversations take more backbone than any kind of work, and you have to choose to have them anyway, scared and clumsy and late. I picked up the phone for Claire. I sat down at the table for Nora. Neither one felt brave in the moment. They just felt necessary, and I'd run out of good reasons not to. A clock keeps time whether or not anybody is listening to it. People don't. People wind down in silence, and they stay wound down until somebody loves them enough to reach in. I am not going to be the man who waited until he was gone to say the thing that mattered. Not while my girl is 1 room away with a pencil in her hand, still wondering, even a little, whether her old man is glad she's his.